This lecture about spatial data and everyday life is intended to be viewed prior to the reading for this week. The reading this week, albeit short, is pretty dense and introduces a lot of topics and a lot of terminology that you're probably not familiar with at this point. So I'm going to go over some of that stuff now, and then when you read the article, you have a little bit better sense of what the authors are trying to say about how spatial big data in particular kind of impacts the everyday life of individuals that are using these devices and this data is being collected about. So this lecture just provides a little context into some terminology. We'll discuss what big data is, what spatial data is, talk about geotagging and other forms of user-generated content, go over some of the privacy and the governance of spatial big data, talk about its economic and its effective value, and then briefly discuss its impact on subjectivities. Much of the article you're reading is going into detail about the impact of spatial big data onto subjectivities, onto kind of our interpersonal relationships and sense of self and perceptions and movements and behaviors. That's what subjectivities kind of means. And a lot of the article is talking about how the spatial big data aspects really impact that part of our life. So this lecture will give you a little bit more context and like what all those different aspects of spatial big data is, how we can think about it, some of the concerns, the way it's governed, the way that it's viewed as valuable in various aspects of society and whatnot. All right, so big data typically refers to extremely large data sets, and these are often analyzed computationally to reveal large-scale patterns and trends. This is particularly related to human behavior and interactions. So specifically, when we think about big data, we really talk about the 5 V's of big data. Okay, and I'll give you an example going through. See, this becomes a little bit more clear after I go through the 5 V's. So the first one, volume. So whenever we're thinking about a big data set, we're really talking about the amount of data that's being produced. You know, how many users are actively contributing to this database? Hundreds of thousands, millions sometimes of people are wearing or using Instagram, for instance, right? And so if millions of people are using Instagram, all of that data that's being generated in Instagram is compiling into a single data set, right? And that's known as a big data set with a high amount of volume. Then we have the velocity of the data. How frequently is data being produced? Is it something that's being produced daily, hourly, every minute? You know, what's the frequency or what's the rate in which new data is produced and added to this database? And then what's the variety of data that's being produced? You know, there's a whole bunch of different types of data that can be derived from various digital devices. This can be personal data, this can be qualitative data, quantitative, spatial data, temporal data. So there's all sorts of different types of data that can be produced. And a big data set typically likes to have a lot of different varieties of data, so it can analyze it in a variety of different ways. What's the veracity of data being produced? So how accurate is this data? You know, to what extent can it be biased? To what extent can it be misleading? How is it validated or verified? So there's a whole bunch of different things when we talk about data accuracy to think about in terms of these giant data sets being produced. And then value. You know, what's the utility of the data? How is it valued by the company that's collecting it? How is it valued by the individual that's producing it? How is it valued by third-party actors that acquire it? That's kind of the big one, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. And when I was putting this together, it kind of reminded me of this episode of South Park, I think from season 1. And this is kind of the model that a lot of the data-derived tech apps kind of work from. Is we kind of phase 1, we'll develop this app, we'll develop this technology, we'll develop this user-generated thing. Phase 2, we don't really know what's going on, right? Phase 3, we'll make profit. And then, as we'll talk about in a bit, how something translates from, let's say, not underpants in the case of the underpants gnomes episode here, but let's say this is in the case of like the app Map My Run, for instance, which collects data about people's running paths and biometrics associated with running, so that the people that are using the app can attach it to a wearable device or link it with a wearable device, or can track various aspects of their athletic performance and see if they're improving over time, map the routes they're running, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say that's phase one. We developed this running app that measures spatial location and biometrics and performance and et cetera, et cetera. Phase two, something happens. And then phase three, we make profit for all the people that invested in the app so we could get it off the ground, right? And so this is the question: how does something that users can download on their phone in order to like make maps of their run and to track their running time and performance, how can that make profit, right? And so we'll talk about that in a minute, but it kind of always leads to one path of how that makes profit. So let's take an example of Uber, the very popular ride-sharing app that many of us, probably all of us, have used at various times, right? You open up the app in your phone, it tracks where you're at within the city map, right? It says, okay, here's your location here. From that, you can see what cars are available for you to call. You can hit a button on your phone that's going to send a ping to the driver. The driver will then say, oh, there's a passenger I can pick up, and then you can hail a ride in that capacity, right? So very popular in urban areas, has kind of transformed the taxi service and changed it pretty dramatically in a lot of places. So let's say that we're doing an analysis of, we work for Uber, and we're hired to do an analysis of all of the Uber data for one city over the course of a year. So all of the data from San Francisco between January 1st, 2022 and December 31st, 2023. That's our data set, right? So every piece of information that has been derived from Uber over that course of the year. And that's a pretty standard, like, big data set size that's used for analysis. And this data set is going to encompass a range of information related to Uber's operation and can provide insight into transportation patterns, into customer behaviors, and into operational efficiency. So if we think about this from a big data standpoint, what's the volume of data in this particular project, right? We have all this different types of data: trip data, driver data, pricing data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's the volume of data that's coming from that? That depends on the users and the frequency of use, but we can infer that if this is all of the data from a large metropolitan area over the course of a year, and every Uber ride within that, that's going to be a massive volume of data, right? Probably millions and millions of, tens of millions of unique data points. Each ride, and each individual ride being a unique data point. So a massive amount of volume, right? A high amount of velocity in terms of there's day-to-day changes, hour-to-hour changes. So when we think about velocity of a data set like this, it's not just one instance where there's a bunch of data, but it's something that accumulates consistently over time, right? So if we analyze this week by week or day by day or month by month, then we would see rates of change. That's what's meant by velocity. In variety, we can see a lot of different variety of data here, right? There's trip data, there's pricing data, there's user feedback, there's traffic and road conditions. So there's a wide variety of spatial, temporal, quantitative, qualitative, demographic data that's all being collected within these data sets. If we think about veracity or the accuracy of the data, any time that there's transactional data generation, so as opposed to social media data, which is user generated and is of opinion and preference and page viewership and things like that, Uber data in this case is transactional, right? Like the data is generated from sort of transfer of money for service, and because of that, it's often a much more accurate or a much more kind of easily validated set of data. Whereas opposed to social media data, might be a little bit more hard to validate because there's a lot more noise in terms of like how people are hitting like buttons or sharing or things like that. That doesn't necessarily always equate to preference or like, whereas opposed to transactional data like this does indicate like a moment, a discrete moment that has started and stopped, and a transaction has occurred during that time frame. Um, so as a result, we can say that this data has a high amount of veracity. And then finally, the value. What is the value of this data? We can think about that from a couple different points of view. So why would Uber be interested in urban traffic patterns as one point of view to think about its value? So internally, why would Uber as a company be interested in the traffic patterns that it can derive from analyzing all of its data in a city over the course of a year? It can help maximize the operational efficiency of the Uber network, right? So you can say, oh, we need to have, based on this data, we need to ensure that there's this many drivers at this time. We can have whatever the kind of the contract structure for drivers is. We can have pricing variations depending on time of day. We can have places in the road network that we want to avoid at certain times of day. So we can have rerouting information. We can use this information to advocate regional planning departments to increase highway capacity by showing that there's an increased demand on highways at particular times, and use that as a mechanism to divert money away from public transportation, making the society more car dependent and making Uber as a functional aspect of that car dependent culture. So that's one thing that is done with this urban traffic pattern information that is derived in this capacity. And another could be, as Uber transitions to accumulating all this data in order to make driverless cars and automated road networks, right? That data is useful in understanding how traffic patterns could impact the automation of traffic systems or car systems. So why would Uber be interested in consumer behavior? This is essentially like a schematic of what a algorithm chart looks like, and I'll show you a more fully fleshed out example later. But this is basically how an algorithm works, right? Is that based on a set of variables, these are called radar charts, and based on a set of variables, we can measure through the data how each individual relates to different variables, right? And create like a personalized profile. And this is this radar chart's a visualization of that profile for the four beetles. But you can think of a much more complex personalization chart based on consumer behavior within Uber, right? Where people like to go, what people are doing. Are they valuing markup prices or luxury vehicles? Are they, is there like an economic valuation that's going into it? Are they using Uber during like business hours versus during entertainment hours, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of build up these consumer behavior profiles and see what types of consumers are using what products at what times and what locations, and then customize and tailor your network of cars to maximize profit within that capacity. And then why would Uber be interested in the operational efficiency of its cars? The main reason is what they have is dynamic pricing structures. They don't just have the same price for everything all the time, but depending on all these other variables, traffic, demand, time of day, events, etc., they have what's known as surge pricing, and surge pricing means that the user pays a higher premium in order to use the Uber at that particular time. And with the operational efficiency metrics that are built into this large data set, Uber can then say, as opposed to saying like, oh, our markup time is like during rush hour, so 8 or 7 to 9 in the morning and 4 to 6 at night. Those are surge times, and the price is double during that time or whatever. It can actually say, based on location and based on events that are happening at that location, we can have kind of real-time surge pricing based on this demand metric to based on the number of drivers and based on how many users are like opening the app at that particular time. So that surge pricing, that dynamic pricing, can be highly tailored to specific locations, specific events, and like small windows of time when there's increased demand. So this is a example of a concert getting out in a particular location, right? And so then in that surge pricing, that dynamic surge pricing model that's based on the operational capacities of Uber, you can analyze that and say like, okay, during these times, within 6 square blocks of this particular venue, we can have double or triple the price of our product because there's a demand, a discrete demand for that, and we can like measure what that demand is in real-time accuracy and adjust accordingly. So all that data can be used based, from the understanding the broader patterns of the network to understanding the consumer itself to understanding like minute variations in the operation of the product in order to maximize profit, in order to increase the amount of ridership, etc. So that's all an example of a big data set, right? And it has those 5 V's as really what distinguishes it from other types of data sets. And you noticed within that, I brought up the idea of spatial data quite a bit. And so spatial data refers to information that's explicitly about the physical location or the shape or the placement of objects on the Earth's surface. So this can be represented in various forms: latitude, longitude, addresses, vectors, which are polygons or points or lines that are placed on a map, and satellite imagery as well. So spatial data encompasses a whole bunch of different types of data, but what's key about that data is that it is explicitly tied to a location on the Earth. And why does spatial data matter? Spatial data provides key geographic context to help understand the patterns and the relationships and the real world processes of what's happening with that data set. So instead of just having, oh, here's a bunch of people that are operating and they're generating this data in various ways, excuse me, we can say that data that they're generating, those behaviors are correlated to particular types of locations or environments or interactions or whatever, right? So there's an additional layer of context that's given to the data, and that context really matters because all of these things happen in a particular place, right? And so having that place as a variable for your analysis helps to create a finer resolution or a more complete picture of what that user is doing. Spatial data can also allow us to make maps, and that's like a key component of understanding these patterns and these relationships, is being able to map that onto a digital or a paper map. Maps have this really unique capacity to share a lot of information with people in a very quick manner, even more so than images. Like maps can really articulate aspects about the relationship between people and the environment in a very substantial way. And so being able to have all this data that you can then map and then change the different variables of the data, the visual qualities of the map in order to convey information is critical, particularly when trying to understand those patterns and relationships. Having spatial data allows you to have a better sense of the real world application of all this data you're collected. And so then you can use that to inform planning, to inform the management, to inform emergency response capabilities of the environment based on all this data that you have. And then spatial data also is dynamic. It changes over time. It changes, events are not static in place, but as time moves, then what's happening in particular places changes as well. And that allows you to see trends and, again, see patterns, see rhythms to the world over time. So another example here of a spatial data application using big data. So if we have this map here, you can probably infer from this map and the numbers, and you may have seen something similar. This is a map of air quality during wildfire season. And so we can see, the whole West Coast has a visual variable of dark red to purple, which is indicative of poor air quality. And then the green over throughout the rest of the country um, is indicative of good air quality, right? So kind of a normal color gradation of green to red that we typically use to denote positive value to negative value, or healthy to unhealthy, or go to stop, or whatever that kind of like variable gradient is. Um, we're using that here as well to monitor air quality. Okay, so here's the example of spatial big data being used in a variety of capacities. So some of you may be familiar with what's known as the Purple Air Sensor Network. And what Purple Air sensors are is they're individual air quality monitors that you can buy and put outside your house or outside your business. And then that uh, monitor is automatically fed into an app called Purple Air, right? So the readings that are coming off this air quality monitor are going into an app, right? And so instead of relying on uh, NOAA or other federal agencies' maps of air quality, this is a series of user controlled or citizen controlled network or sensors that form a network that allow us to see kind of air quality monitoring at different areas within the environment in real time. So it's a really cool system because, you know, throughout the country there's tens of thousands of these Purple Air monitors that are outside people's houses or businesses or wherever, and all of them are contributing to this collective data set that you can access in real time and see what the air quality is around you at that particular moment and how it could change based on other sort of weather patterns. So if we think about what are the 5 V's of big data as it relates to the Purple Air monitoring network, we can say, what's our volume? Well, there's 100,000 plus sensors worldwide, these Purple Air sensors, that are taking readings every 5 minutes and contributing that to a data set. And so there's a high velocity of data as well. Every 5 minutes, there's all the sensors in the network are taking a reading and uploading it in real time to this app and to a web map. So we can see in real time a web map of what exactly is happening with the air quality in our local regional environment. We also have a wide variety of data. We have location data, time data of where these sensors are, and then all sorts of various air quality metrics that are associated with understanding the AQI value, the air quality index value. And so the most common is the PM 2.5, particulate matters over 2.5 millimeters. And this is what is produced by wildfire smoke and things like that. But these sensors can also measure things like carbon dioxide and other sorts of chemical readings or atmospheric readings. So there's a variety of data that is associated with the Purple Air monitors. Then the veracity of the data. Studies have shown that it is accurate when compared to more high-tech or more elaborate sensor networks, usually ones that are controlled or maintained by like the National Ocean and Atmospheric Research or different weather stations or things like that. So studies have shown that these little devices are accurate, and they also have calibrations for different local environments. So if you go onto the Purple Air web map, you can change the calibration feature to say, oh, I want this to like match a coastal environment where there's fog that can push the smoke down. There's also like wind patterns that can push it out in different ways than say like a high mountain environment in Colorado, for instance, where the air quality, the atmospheric aspects of Colorado change like the way that the air quality index measures something as opposed to a coastal foggy environment. So you can change those and calibrate it to different local environments within the Purple Air setup, right? And that allows for calibration and increased level of accuracy. And then the value, how does this value? Well, it can inform the individual and the community health, right? It can inform the user in a variety of ways. Both if you have a sensor that you have at your own house, you can see exactly what the air quality index is for your particular home. And they even have indoor sensors as well. That's a different network, but they have indoor and outdoor sensors. So you can measure, the air quality and the health of your own home in that capacity. and then also like rely on the web map to look at your community and see what the impacts of wildfire smoke is or other pollutants, air pollutants are on your environment explicitly. And so that can inform both your own individual behaviors, and it's also increasingly informing like community and public health campaigns. So a couple of looks at this in action. So this is a just a screenshot of the web interface of the purple air quality. This is one you can just pull it up at any time and see what the air quality index is at your particular moment. There's gray ones out here. These ones are offline right now. But there's a number of them in our local environment that can give you a good sense of how the air quality is changing in the local microclimates. For instance, last year, for example, last fall, there was quite a bit of wildfire smoke here where I live in Eureka. But we could tell by looking at the purple air map that it was actually fine down in Ferndale. We went down there for the county fair. So while the smoke had kind of like concentrated in this area, down this area, just due to some regional climate changes and variations, it had cleared out of this area in the Eel River Delta and Ferndale area pretty nicely, and it was pretty good enough to go outside and go enjoy the county fair at that time, while it was still pretty sucked in up here in Eureka and Arcata. And so that allows you to make decisions based on kind of this real-time application of understanding how the smoke or the air quality is distributed across the environment. It also allows you to intersect the air quality index with local weather forecasting to understand like what direction is the air quality going. Is it getting worse or is it getting better, basically? And so that can help inform your decision making as well. You say, okay, the air quality is not great right now, but I can see based on its integration with AccuWeather or whatever sort of weather app that it has, is that there's some wind that's going to blow it out, blow the smoke out and blow fresh air in the next 30 minutes. So I can kind of plan in the next 30 minutes I'm going to stay inside for a little bit longer, but then in 30, 45 minutes I can go out and do chores or errands or whatever, because then the air quality will shift and be more suitable for human activity. So that integration of the monitoring system, right, along with the weather forecasting system can help understand not only where we're at that particular moment, but what we can expect in the next hour, next day, whatever. Purple air has also been vital for public health research. We can take all these different monitors and all these different data points, and we can infer or interpolate a surface of air quality over the entire state. So in this case, what we have in California is upwards of 5,000 of these purple air monitors throughout the state that are distributed across the state in different ways and different capacities. We can take all those readings from all those discrete points and transfer that to a surface, so then we can understand based on the data and inferring what's in between the known data points, we can get a sense of what the statewide public health impacts are to particular wildfire events, right? And smoke events. And so that can be really helpful to helping understand not only the public health impacts, but also what are mitigation strategies, what are policies that could go in place to help people not be as impacted in particular areas that are particularly prone to these smoky events based on all sorts of variables. It can also, in addition to having kind of these broader studies of public health, it can help us from a management or from a community standpoint think about what mitigation, what strategies can go in to help minimize or eliminate the impact of wildfire smoke on the communities in the state. This could be anything from forest management policies to prescribed burning policies to the development and the development of educational materials to the public so they know the impacts of smoke more keenly, or even having clean air sites in areas that are particularly hard hit. So there's all sorts of different strategies that can come from having this robust set of public health knowledge about how wildfire smoke impacts communities in California. And then from that, we can make strategies both for the mitigation of fires itself, for public health responses to wildfire or to smoke events in communities, making sure that we can uh, provide resources for people that are particularly vulnerable, people with asthma, et cetera, et cetera. So, having a higher level of knowledge about what the event is allows for a higher level of community engagement and awareness and prevention. And this can go in the form of policy, basically, in that top-down kind of structure. Like I was saying, it can change our wildland policy or our forest management policy. It can also help disseminate information to individual households about like what are small steps you can take in your household, whether that's here's the materials that you need to build wildfire smoke reduction devices indoors so you can help purify and clean the air inside your house. And so it can help, kind of that whole transect of policy from kind of broad picture of large geographic areas and management of resources and forest management practices and wildfire reduction practices, et cetera, all the way down to like the household of like, here are individual things that you can do in your household to help mitigate this effect and be prepared for when this season happens. And so purple air is like a really cool example of how spatial big data applications are being used in this way that informs and contributes to a broader set of public knowledge, not only about wildfire events, but also about mitigation practices of those events and helping individuals get a sense of what the air quality environment is around them so they can make individual choices based on that. Okay. And so a lot of these different things like Uber or like the purple air monitoring system, those are all collecting data that's largely in a passive way, right? Like we're using the technology and it's collecting data, and we know that it's collecting data, but we're not actively like telling it what data to collect or actively pinning our personal information or our data to something, where that differs a bit from user-generated data. So this typically refers to geographic elements, typically involving location or movements that are intentionally linked to different types of predominantly social media events, right? So we can say we're uploading pictures to Instagram and we're going to add a geotag to those so that there's a spatial location of that picture we're contributing that to the data set. And that's typically, and there's lots of different forms of user-generated content. One that is particularly interesting and particularly probably most common is the use of geotags, which that involves adding some sort of geographical metadata, often to pictures, but also to videos or other types of social media or communication platforms. So here's an example of geotagged photos in New York over the course of a year, and it reveals a pretty interesting pattern about how we understand the city. So oftentimes when people are geotagging photos, they're not geotagging the photos of their everyday life or like their things that they visit at the grocery store or going down the street or doing their day-to-day activities. Typically people geotag things when they're in locations that they want to memorialize or remember or share in a particular way. So oftentimes, places that are special, places that were out of the ordinary, normal, day-to-day aspects of our life, that might be something that we'll more frequently geotag. So we can see here in New York, right, most of the geotags here are happening in Central Park, Times Square, right, Brooklyn Bridge here, former site of the World Trade Center down here, Statue of Liberty here, right? So these are not the places that the people that live in New York are visiting as frequently as tourists. So this map gives us a good sense of like tourist movement in New York City, but not necessarily a good sense of like the movements and the activity hotspots of people that actually live in the city. the airport out here. So whenever we're thinking about geotagged photos, right, there's an intentionality to it, and that intentionality is often linked with a certain set of behavior that may not necessarily match like the day-to-day activities that we engage in all the time, right? Like we don't geotag photos every time we go to work necessarily, or every time we go to the grocery store, but we might geotag photos when we go to this particularly special place, or this place that we want to share or memorialize in a particular way. And we do this for a variety of reasons. One is to share information with others. One is to catalog information for our own memory and our own purposes. One is so we can make displays where we can put our photos onto a map application and then have that as a record of where we were and how we can link like those events and those landscapes that we took pictures of, and can we link that to kind of the spatial geographic imaginary that we can create through our travels and through our movements. And so there can be something, personal and special about the practice of geotagging, because then it allows us to keep a record, keep like a geographic record of what we've done and what we valued, what we've taken pictures of, what we want to remember. And we don't really necessarily run into those same situations that potentially we have in the past, where we have some photos and we're like, oh, I don't remember where this was even from or when this was even from. Having those photos, being able to place those on a map can help kind of jog that personal memory of like where these came into being, why it's important to me, etc. But of course, there's always like a downside of any sort of practices where you're providing some sort of spatial information associated with some sort of event, right? And you're doing that actively. And so, here's an example of a wildlife reserve in Botswana saying, please turn off the geotag function because it's leading to the increased endangerment of this species of rhinoceros, right? So don't disclose where the photo is taken, because that gives clues to people who are wanting to poach these animals. And we'll talk more about this next week, about geotagging and some of the various aspects of that, controversies around geotagging, issues of gatekeeping, issues of access, impacts on the environment, et cetera, et cetera. That'll be next week's module. So we'll go into this in more detail. But it's an interesting. Whenever we're doing any sort of practice, there's always unintended consequences of those practices, and geotagging is a great example of that. And it's something as simple as saying like, oh, I want to put a location with this photo, so it allows me to share that with others and to memorialize that and to like give that some sort of real world value that I can return to. It has these negative impacts as well, of allowing others to see where things are that they potentially want to exploit, or that they want to visit, which causes overcrowding or whatever, right? So we'll talk about it more next week, but it's an interesting debate. It's like, how much is the geotagging of various environmental places, how much is that having a negative impact on the real world and on the environment? So we'll talk about this next week, but in a sneak preview of what we'll be reading in the future. Okay, and then a couple other things. The amount of spatial data that we have that is about our locations and our movements, that definitely exposes a wide array of sensitive information outwardly, right? And that can include our habits and our behaviors, but also our home address, right, where we work. If we have a bunch of different, locational pings that happen at one place, and that's in like a neighborhood, for instance, if you plot that on a map and you see that's in a residential neighborhood, then whoever has that data can infer, okay, this is where this person lives. There's a whole bunch of other pings that happen at this office building. We can infer that's where the person works, activities and behaviors and habits in between. So this can definitely lead to wide-scale privacy invasions, particularly when this data is sold, when this data is hacked, or when this data is used in ways that is not necessarily the way that the individual who is using this technology intended for it to be used. So just an example here as well. Even if you have your GPS turned off in your phone, for instance, and you have every single locational aspect of your phone is turned off, but you still have your cell phone network actively running, it's still creating this triangulation of your location based on its pings from cell phone towers, right? So the way that cell phones work essentially is that it creates a signal by triangulating your position based on three cell phone network towers. Um, and whenever there's a triangulation, right, then there's some sort of positional accuracy that's associated with that. And so here's an example that my former advisor made a couple years back, that he went to a baseball game in Seattle when he was there for a conference. He sat up here in the cheap seats, right? Turned his phone off, turned the location stuff off, or turned all the location, the GPS stuff in his phone off, but kept the cell phone cellular data on, and then downloaded those uh, cell phone tower communication data points afterwards. And you can even see from that, it's like, okay, you don't know exactly where he was during this time, but you know that he was at a baseball game, right? And you know that he was generally in this area because over the course of, every 10 minutes for the course of a game, it created a data point, right? Based on just the interaction of your cell phone with cell phone network. So even turning off all of the location data, disabling the GPS, all that stuff, there's still kind of a tracer of where you're at all times whenever you have your cell phone with you. And so that's kind of like what can happen behind the scenes, even if you try to mitigate your location data from being stored. And then oftentimes we're actively trying to plot our location data for our own purposes, right? Like this, some different users using Map My Run at any given time, right? And so here's people that are actively sharing their information because they want to curate and catalog what routes they're running, what their performance is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, how they're improving over time, if they're training for a marathon or there's all sorts of different reasons that you'd want to track and highlight your performance, both sharing it and analyzing it yourself for your own reasons, right? So anytime you're doing that, you're also sending outward that data out into the Map My Run ecosystem, right? You can say, oh, Map My Run has my data because I've given it to them, right? And in that capacity, my assumption is that it's being used for internal purposes within the app, right? That the app itself is using my data so I can get information about myself. But there's another key component to it, like what is happening to your data once it enters that app ecosystem. And this is where we return to the underpants gnome example, right? So there's Map My Run made this app so you could plot your movements on a map, and you could understand your performance and whatnot, right? But there's not really a huge market to like make millions of dollars based on that. Even if you charge people a certain amount of money to use your product, people could use other products that do the exact same thing. So what you're charging for them is your name value of your product. That doesn't really lead to continual constant growth, right? And whenever you're trying to say, what are these companies trying to do? Well, they're trying to make money not at one particular point, but they're trying to make continual exponential growth of money over time, right? They're trying to accumulate capital for their shareholders to increase their stock value. So how do we actually do that? What's that question mark in the underpants gnome example to take app question mark product or profit, right? And that has predominantly been with tech companies to sell your phone's location data outwardly to a variety of different actors. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's like the apps themselves, they are almost worthless, right? But the data that comes out of that, that's where all of the value lies. And this has like a wide range of impacts. We'll talk about this more upcoming this semester. But there's a wide range of impacts that go into your spatial location and your activities being commodities, right? Of being things that can be sold and things that can be analyzed and profiles that can be made of you and various repercussions of that. So one example, there's a um, app for Muslims to find locations to pray when they're traveling or in unfamiliar location. So they can find mosques or other places they can go pray at particular times. Well, this data for this app was being sold, or the company that developed the app, right, was called Xmode, was collecting that data and it was selling it to Department of Defense contractors, right? And that contractor was using that to create profiles of people that were being watched within a surveillance network, right? And so there was a clear linkage between a practice, right, and that practice being turned into a surveillance network. And this other company, Vental, was doing the same thing. It was acquiring location data from all these different apps, right? And it was selling that location data, compiling profiles of people and selling that location data to agencies for immigration enforcement, right? And so like the apps that people were using, what they were accessing on those apps, and how that was linked to other sort of like demographic and social media and preference and things like that, all of that was becoming kind of collected, coalesced, and sold to federal agencies for the enforcement of immigration. So it's a bit, it's not as superficial, or it's not like a trivial thing. It's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that has insanely impactful consequences to individuals, to communities, to our overall kind of humanity in the world. And so that's data that's being collected and sold. There's also all of this data that's vulnerable because it's stored on servers that are vulnerable to hackings or to data breaches or whatever. There was one just recently, a couple years ago, where 61 million people's fitness activities that were tied up with Fitbit were exposed in a data breach, right? And so that's a huge number of people, first of all. But you also think about like, oh, what are these wearable devices monitoring? They're monitoring all sorts of individual health data, right? About your blood sugar level, about your movement, about your medicines that you're taking, about heart rates. So all these things that are associated with your individual personal health, all of those got leaked, or all of those got hacked in some sort of data breach, right? And so what are the repercussions of that type of data breach happening? And so when you think about the governance of this privacy, right? How are our federal and state institutions protecting the user from these data banks, basically, from acquiring your data and then selling it to other actors that have questionable or nefarious purposes, right? So how is the state or the federal government regulating these industries? And the answer is that the U.S. has generally avoided regulation of tech industries for a number of reasons. The main predominant justification is that it restricts growth, or it restricts innovation, right? So growth in the tech sector, new technological developments, those are hindered by regulation. And so there's been a preference for self-regulation by government institutions, right? Obviously, there's a conflict of interest from the tech companies themselves saying, oh, we have to regulate our own technologies to ensure that there's ethical considerations and privacy are considered. And so this conflict of interest can lead to inadequate protections and breaches in data, the use of data for purposes that the user doesn't know, all sorts of privacy issues. So the idea that industry is going to self-regulate themselves, right, which is what our predominant approach until very recently has been about the tech industry, is obviously like a flawed mechanism, because the tech companies are driven by profit, right? And if we say, oh, the biggest way to monetize the data that's being collected by people is to sell that data to other people, right, to other actors, then limiting that, expecting the tech companies to limit that themselves is foolhardy. So there's also a lack of standardization in the self-regulation practices. So there are state laws, and those state laws differ state to state. So that's why, some things can happen. Like California has pretty robust consumer protection laws, where other states have no consumer protection laws. So there's a balance of how things are regulated state to state. And there's also um, the process that technology is advancing at a faster pace than regulatory frameworks can come into place, or more explicitly, how lawmakers' knowledge of technology works. So, as a result, new technologies are being deployed faster than the understanding of what the repercussions of that are even um, articulated, right? And so we'll talk about this a lot more when we talk about artificial intelligence and geoengineering. But there's things, the progression of technology far outpaces the progression of both the lawmakers' knowledge and of like the slow moving body of federal and state institutions to mitigate or to address these issues. And that's only like increasing. That disconnect, that temporal disconnect is only increasing, as we talked about with Moore's law. As technology exponentially increases, the capacity of technology exponentially increases, then similarly our inability to deal with the repercussions that kind of exponentially increase as well. If we look at a map of the current kind of like legislative, regulatory patchwork, we can see that there's actually like more and more states are coming up with some sort of consumer data privacy laws. Whereas a couple years ago, if you looked at the same map from 2021, for instance, it'd be like California and Virginia, and that'd be about it. So there's more states that are coming up with regulatory frameworks for data privacy. So simultaneously, there's been more pushback and more like campaign finance and donations to particular candidates that are wanting to get rid of regulatory frameworks in states. So I mentioned Virginia, as one that for a long time has had pretty robust data consumer privacy frameworks in place, but then simultaneously, while other states were coming online with more regulatory frameworks, Amazon was actively like working to donate campaign finances to people in Virginia that would push for the deregulation of these data privacy things. And the kind of payback, I guess, was that Amazon would build locations in Virginia, right? So there's kind of this nefarious and unethical movement of money from Amazon specifically to Virginia legislative bodies to defund and deregulate the regulatory frameworks that existed within Virginia to protect consumer privacy. And then like the promise was that Amazon would then build warehouses and distribution plants and headquarters and whatnot in Virginia as a way to grease the wheels, I guess is a better way of saying it, for that process to happen. So that's something to keep in track of, is like as some states introduce legislation to protect consumer privacy, other states, tech companies are actively working to minimize that in other states. And then at the federal level, it's a complete mess. There's the federal government is essentially incapable of doing something in this capacity, just because there's so much money, dark money involved, so many special interest groups involved within the congressional framework, that there's almost no mechanism for any sort of like comprehensive federal data consumer privacy act to pass Congress or the Senate. So it's up to the states in a lot of ways, and then the states, there's like vulnerabilities within the state patchwork frameworks of regulatory networks to expose or deregulate or whatever. So something to keep track of is like what states are coming online, what states are going offline, I guess, in terms of its regulation. Okay, so almost done. Sorry, it's kind of long-winded. So what's some of the economic values of spatial big data? We've talked about this some as well already, but the targeting, advertisements, and the enhanced location-based services that go along with having all of this spatial big data is critically important to a lot of companies, right? You can make targeted uh, advertisements based on where people are. You can, when people go within a certain perimeter, what's known as geofencing, then then advertisements can pop up, get pinged to their phone, and notifications can come up of advertisements or of services that are tied explicitly to location. And then, like I mentioned, the data monetization. This is like kind of the crazy aspect that's most. There's like multiple tiers of data monetization, right? And so you can think about each of these individual apps that you have. They collect like different pieces of data. Like you say, it might use MyFitnessPal, and that collects some subset of data. And then you might use Airbnb, and that collects another set of data. And you use Uber, and that collects a certain set of data. Then you use whatever, a dating app, and that collects another set of data, right? And so all of these different texts and apps that you use have little pieces of data that they collect. And then there's all of these data warehouses or data portfolios that are basically buying up all of these individual data elements from all of these different tech companies. Typically, when the tech company is going through some sort of either they want money for expansion or they're going through some sort of bankruptcy or something like that. When those companies are particularly financially vulnerable, they'll sell that data off at a cheaper rate, basically. And so these data portfolio warehouses will buy up all this data, right? Um, and they'll create these kind of very robust profiles of individuals that have thousands of different attributes and factors. And so it's this algorithm. You can think about, I showed you that picture earlier of that like simplistic one of the Beatles and their different kind of like songwriting and personality compositions, right? That were on 5 different variables. You can think about that same sort of graphic, but for up to 3,000 different variables, different demographic, activity, relationship, income, livelihood, health, all these different types of variables, right? Like 3,000 of them. And if you spread that over this particular data warehouse, Axiom has 700 million people in their database, right? So that's like an enormous amount of people with an enormous amount of individual personalization profiles about those people that are all kind of provided to these individual apps and then coalesced under these larger frameworks or these larger data consolidation companies, right? And then those companies have like a very robust profile of the individual that can then be sold to other institutions or other financial partners or whatever, right? And those things can be sold to governments for surveillance. They can be sold to credit card companies for financial monitoring. So there's all sorts of different ways that like that those individual pieces that you contribute to all the little apps that you have kind of coalesce into a broader profile of you as an individual that then that has like very real economic value to outside forces, both for uh, potentially beneficial reasons to you. You could you'd meet certain economic criteria and be targeted with a low interest rate loan to buy a house or something like that. But also for nefarious purposes of surveillance of people that are from marginalized groups or of dissenting political views or whatever. So there's a wide range of positive and negative repercussions of having these like monetization of all your personal data into these like robust, extensive profiles. Mostly nefarious, to be honest, but there are some, I suppose, beneficial aspects or valuable aspects that can come out of that are not nefarious. But they, even if they are good intention, they still are like invading on your privacy in this kind of weird economic collective way. Um, so and one of the ways that economic value from spatial big data has created a more efficient or a more seamless system of inventory and of supply chain and things like that. If you think of how Amazon functions, and that you can order something and then within like 36 hours it'll be at your door, right? Is like an insane kind of logistical thing, right? Especially considering where we live, we can order like an obscure vacuum part, for instance, and it'll be in our house in like 48 hours. And so that kind of like completely differs from the traditional supply chain of having to go to specialty shops to get specialty products that take 3 weeks to order, and then all of a sudden the whole process gets extended this huge period of time, and there's all these different kind of choke points of where the supply chain breaks down or where things get stalled or whatever. It's relies on individuals, and there's bottlenecks and all sorts of kind of various supply chain issues. Having all of this data about what people want, when they want it, how they want it, has allowed Amazon in particular to maximize its supply chain efficiency, which has made the procurement of an obscure vacuum part very easy, for instance. But it's also made, eroded like local businesses that for years and years had specialized in being able to get that part for you. Now, that value has been stripped away from that local business that did that, albeit in a slower and less efficient way. Amazon has like coalesced all of those different individual businesses into a single kind of supply chain framework that is very efficient, but not without its negative impacts as well. And then we can talk about the effective value of spatial big data. How does this impact our emotional, our psychological, or our social benefits of both ourselves and of the broader community? So there's a lot of different data portals called open data portals. This particularly happens in cities and for regional governments where a bunch of data is accessible to the public in ways that allow for individual researchers, activists, community partners, nonprofits, et cetera, to have like access to all of this different municipal and regional data, and then create new products that can be really impactful and empower the community in really cool ways. So here's a bunch of tree data, that is in the open data portal for New York, that then can be used to understand plant biodiversity within the city, to understand things like urban foraging, where fruit trees are, to understand where protected species are, the age of trees, all sorts of different ways that can contribute to the aesthetic beauty of a place, that can contribute to kind of lived experience of being in a city and finding, secret little places that are beautiful or unique or have this nice level of like urban biodiversity or whatever, right? So, being able to access this network of tree data, this database of tree data from the Open City portal allows people that are advocating for particular ecological or studying, insects or whatever, to have this like robust data set that's easily accessible. So it really does empower a lot of communities, community partners or community activists or individuals to make like interesting and positive discoveries about place in a really cool way, to be used to enhance public services. So in Boston, for instance, due to the nature of the street network and kind of how old the infrastructure is and how it was initially arranged, enhancing the road network so it can hold an increased capacity of cars in Boston is almost impossible. So what the city has done is it empowered the Massachusetts Transit Authority to really invest in kind of the smart monitoring of its bus network, and so users have the ability to kind of know exactly what their route is, exactly what the time is, exactly what the stops are. The infrastructure of the city can accommodate public transportation more so than individual cars, right? And so like a lot of the barriers that typically prevent people from using public transportation, not knowing the time of the schedule, not knowing the route, uncertainty about whatever, freedom they would have within using that public transportation system. A lot of those things are removed because that system has been digitized in a way that allows people to use it without those barriers. Um, and therefore it has enacted and enabled Boston to be less car congested, more livable, more walkable, more enjoyable because it's not kind of packed with cars in the space where cars really can't be at that capacity. Um, and so spatial data can really help improve the public services in places when used in a particular way. Of the effective value of spatial big data could be in the protection and monitoring of wild animals, plants, and environmental features. So this particular example, the Cornell lab came up with an app called eBird, which monitors and records the location and habitat information, nesting information of all different types of bird species. And that includes the migratory patterns of these species. So in this way, we can use these data applications to understand in more detail particular habitats, places that should be protected in order to kind of maximize the capabilities, the nesting capabilities, or the migratory capabilities of particular bird species, find wildlife corridors. So this can lead to not only like a better understanding of particular species and their habits, but also the protection of particular environmental features or places or habitats that can cut across political boundaries in a pretty interesting way. And so, all this spatial big data, we talk a lot about its negative impacts, but it also has these other impacts that can be of value, particularly of non-economic values. And finally, when we think about, and this is what a lot of the article is about, is talking about the subjectivities, or the ways that the individual experiences, perceptions, emotions, and thoughts are really shaped not only by the technology we're using, but by the data that technology produces. So we talked a lot in previous weeks about particular technological devices, and you all had different devices, different technologies that you were in charge of kind of thinking about how that impacted different aspects of the human condition, the sense of self, perceptions of space-time, political boundaries, etc. And a lot of that was focused on the device itself, right? But when we think about the data that device produces, that's an equal part of trying to understand, how these different technological devices and data applications that we populate our lives with, how those impact our subjectivities or our human experiences, perceptions, emotions, thoughts, behaviors, etc. So some different things at this, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions a bit more based on the reading. But as we discussed, those kind of experiences and perceptions, habits, perceptions of space-time, sense of self, those are all heavily impacted by the data that we produce, that we send outward, and then in turn that returns back to us in various ways. It produces a certain sense of emotional responses. Some of that is the fear of missing out that often we see in social media applications, is that we see so much that looks so provocative and so enjoyable. This is one of the reasons that geotag locations are so effective at trying to draw our attention to a particular place and inspiring us to go to that place as well. Because we see something, we have a fear of not seeing it, or we have a fear of missing out on a particular way, or a particular environment, or a particular thing. So that's an emotional aspect of these data networks. Another aspect is content fatigue, and this is common, since so much of our experience that we have of the media and of the content that is kind of filtered to us through our social media platforms and through that kind of individualized algorithm that we've produced, a lot of it becomes quite redundant and quite similar and overlaps a lot, and so we don't see a lot of new things in a lot of ways, and so we can really get kind of burnt out and fatigued on seeing the same thing over and over again. It's kind of a strange thing that we have these data indicators of what we like and what we don't like, and those are like fixed from a point in time, and so then this algorithm is created based on these data aspects, and that kind of becomes reinforced because we see the same thing over and over again. That just further entrenches and reinforces those that like moderated content, right? And we talked about filter bubbles as a way of like information being distorted within that process. But there's also like this aspect of it where we just kind of get tired of seeing the same thing, and what we used to like, we no longer like anymore, because we've seen too much of it, because we've matured in our taste, because we've discovered new things that we like more. And then sometimes we can just feel kind of like fatigued or bored or uninspired because we're just seeing a lot of the same redundant things, and it makes us feel that culture has become stagnated, or that you hear things like, oh, they don't make music or movies like they used to, type of sentiments, but that's actually oftentimes a content fatigue phenomenon. And then, yeah, the cultural and social influences that this data has on us. Like I mentioned, there's this personalized algorithm that will feed us content, feed us information, feed us targeted ads, predict our movements, and do all those things. And so that can become really disillusioning in a sense, because we feel like there's a predetermination about what the world is like to us, because the way that our media is filtered based on this data representation of self that we've curated through like what we like and what we do with our phone and the data that goes outward, it returns to us in this way that is not always very satisfying. And it's kind of limited in its cultural representation in a lot of ways too. It doesn't expose us to a variety of things in a lot of ways. It can be limiting. It can be, like I said, there's content fatigue, but there's also kind of disillusionment and lack of diversity that can come through that process, because everything just kind of gets reduced down to this kind of standardized, even though it's individualized for our own taste, it becomes very like formulaic feeling. So that can be a really negative impact of having this like data curation impacting our subjectivities. And then our interpersonal relationships then also suffer from the same thing. If we're using dating apps or using friend meetup apps or whatever, that can really focus on algorithm matching in a lot of ways. You can meet people that have similar interests to you in a lot of ways, but then also you can, in the same way that a filter bubble constricts the ability for new information to come into your realm, these kind of algorithm matching relationship things can limit the different types of people that can come into your realm. And again, that can get kind of making things seem redundant, or feeling a fatigue of interpersonal relationships in the same way. Everything just kind of feels similar and not very inspiring in that way. It can also cause what's called decision paralysis, where so many of our choices kind of feel the same in that capacity that we have become unable to actually like make a decision, because we're trying to like parse out the differences between all these things that are basically the same. It's kind of the same thing that happens like when you go to the store and you want to buy some Advil, and there's like 60 different packages of Advil that are all slightly different shaped bottles, different quantities, different strengths, different target audiences, different aspects to it, whatever. And you're like, I don't know which one to buy. They're all the same, right? And so that's kind of the same thing that happens in all these different kind of interpersonal relationships and content stuff that we get as well. And our subjectivity is kind of impacted by that, because we feel like we can't really make a decision because there's no difference in the decisions. They all kind of feel the same. No matter what decision we make, the outcome's kind of the same. And that's a bit of a bias reinforcement as well, right? Like the biases that we put outward into our data come back to us. And so it's just kind of a self-reinforcing mechanism. Our subjectivity is becoming more and more hardened, is the term, right? Instead of experiencing new things, we just kind of experience the same thing and become more and more kind of ingrained in that rut of experiencing the same things, not really being able to make a decision based on what those is, becoming bored with those decisions, becoming kind of like despondent and a little bit kind of disillusioned by the whole kind of world around us in that process. But it's really because what we're experiencing through these digital mediums that we're kind of surrounding our life with is kind of reflecting ourselves back to us, and sometimes we don't necessarily want to be reflected back what we like or what we think we like, right? We end up seeing that that's not actually what we want to surround ourselves with. It's just our data tracers kind of position us that way. Um, so the article goes into more detail about this specifically, some pretty interesting directions. It's not a very long article, um, and it kind of sets the stage for our conversation next week too, when we talk specifically about geotagging and the environment. So that's kind of the gist of how spatial big data impacts our everyday life. The data that we create, that we curate through these different applications and technologies that we use, where that data goes, how it's used in kind of like various capacities, and then how it kind of filters back to us. Some of the positive and negative impacts of that whole system. And some of the things, just to recap what we talked about what big data is, the 5 V's of big data, what spatial data is, how it helps us see patterns and relationships and allows us to make maps, which is a very cool feature of spatial data. We talked about geotagging and user-generated content, what that means, what are some of the negative impacts of that. We talked about issues of privacy and issues of governance, the regulatory process of our data that we generate. We talked about some of the economic and effective values of that and some of the impacts on our individual subjectivities that are associated with kind of having this curated set of data that we help generate and put out into the atmosphere and then it returns to us in various forms. So I know this was a long lecture. If you made it to the end, I thank you, and I hope that you enjoyed, kind of thinking deeply about these aspects. So let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing your work this week.